So let's welcome now Dr. Daniel Gordis to the stage.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks to all of you for the invitation to be here today. It's really actually a fascinating conversation, and if one could only emulate this across the world, we would all be in much better shape. In 1892, the Jewish world was taken kind of in the power and the thrall of a 19-year-old Jewish kid. And the entire Jewish world almost took note of this 19-year-old Jewish kid because he had written a poem. His name was Chaim Nachman Bialik, and the poem that he wrote, his first published poem, was called Elat Tzipor, to the bird. And it's a poem in which he reaches out and talks to a bird who has just come back from the warm lands, the lands of Palestine. And Bialik asks the bird, does God still have mercy on Zion? Does the dew still fall like pearls on Mount Hermon? Do terrible catastrophes happen there also? 19 years old, and within months, before social media, before the methods of communications that we take for granted today, most of the Jewish world knew about Chaim Nachman Bialik. And he very quickly became the poet laureate of the Jewish people because, as many people after him said, including Zev Jabotinsky, there was nobody who had the capacity to give expression to the Jewish soul the way that Chaim Nachman Bialik did. He wrote, of course, in the end, thousands of poems, but what he did more than anything else was to use a Jewish vocabulary to give expression to the yearnings and the dreams and the disappointments and the pains that people who were deeply embedded in the Jewish world understood. I want to suggest to you in a few minutes that what I think Zionism in the 21st century has to be is, among other things, to revisit that question of where do our yearnings come from? What shapes our dreams? What shapes our fears? What are the texts that we still all share and the poetry that still speaks to all of us that actually binds us together? 14 years later, Bialik writes another poem. It's 1904. It's a year after the Kishinev program of 1903. And he goes to Kishinev and he basically wants to find out what in the world happened. The 20th century was supposed to be a century in which pogroms didn't happen anymore. 1880 and 1881, the pogroms in Russia, that was supposed to be a thing of the past. So what happened? The Jewish world wanted to know. How did the 20th century open up once again with violence against Jews? Little did they know what was going to happen in the 20th century. But in 1903, when Kishinev happened, it seemed pretty horrible. And there's a very, very long poem that he wrote called Be'ir HaRega, and the City of Slaughter. We don't have time to do it anywhere near in depth. But I want to share very, very quickly, and not even do that justice, one brief scene that Chaim Nachman Bialik tells. There's a kind of a docent taking people through the town. This is what happened here, this is what happened there. And the docent takes the person who's looking around, which is really Bialik in a sense, into a cellar. And the docent describes how here in the cellar is where the Cossacks came in, and we're going to skip the gory detail that Bialik provides, and violated time and time again the women in the community. And the women's husbands, sons, brothers, fathers, says Bialik, hid behind a wooden slatted wall. And they peered through, watching what was happening, but didn't dare go out. And says Bialik, they prayed at that moment, please God, spare my skin this day. And then when the Cossacks are done, they leave and they go up. And the men, says Bialik, step out, look at the still, obviously, living bodies of the women who are the most precious people to them in their lives, step over them, go out of the cellar, and the Kohanim, those of the priestly class, go and ask the rabbi a halachic, a Jewish legal question. Tell me, Rabbi, is my wife still permitted to me? It doesn't matter whether that happened or not. It's like watching Macbeth or reading any other great work of literature and asking, is that true? It misses the entire point. Great literature is about asking the reader to think about the human condition, to think about what humanity ought to mean. And what Bialik is saying about these men hiding behind the slatted wall is that there's at least three things wrong with them. Number one, he says, you were weak. What kind of a human being, what kind of a man, to be specific, can't defend his mother or his sister or his wife or his daughter? Who are you? And Bialik actually calls them the sons of the Maccabees. Ironically, Tens of generations later, the Maccabees got rid of the Greeks, and you hide? But then he goes on essentially and implies this. Okay, so you're weak. You can't win every battle. Nobody can expect you to win every battle. But you're cowards, and that's much worse. What he says has happened to the Jew because of centuries of learning in a yeshiva, huddled over a volume of Talmud, always praying that the outside world will not come and touch them, is that the Jew has become a quaking figure living in the dark, dank yeshiva, never learning actually even where to summon the courage to defend the people in his or her family who need defending. And then says Bialik about that thing, about the Kohanim stepping over the bodies of these women who are still alive and who basically want to be held and told that it'll be okay even though it won't be okay. Bialik says Judaism has become actually a cancer that has eviscerated your soul. You're not even human anymore. You see the whole world through the lens of Jewish law, that you are weak, you're fearful, and you don't even think like a human being. And that was not a new idea for the Jewish people, and it certainly wasn't even a new idea for the Zionist movement, which is already aloft by the time Herzl launches it in Basel in 1897. This is 5 years later, a little bit more. But it's basically the declaration of war of the Zionist movement on Jewish tradition. And the origins of Israeli secularism are very different than the origins of American Jewish secularism. American Jewish secularism is largely a matter of erosion. People came from Europe, they knew a lot, they did some, the next generation a little bit less, they did a little bit less, and so on and so on and so forth. Sometimes families kind of revert back, but more or less it was a gradual generational erosion. Not so in Palestine, and not so later on in Israel. It was a slamming of the door, saying that's the Judaism that we don't want. That's the Judaism that turned us into something that we simply don't want to be. And the purpose of Zionism is going to be to create a new Jew. We're going to reimagine the Jew. So instead of those little Rembrandt paintings of dark tones and an old man with a beard huddled over a text, you're going to get those black and white photographs of people in the 1930s plowing the land of the Galilee, holding a rifle in one hand and a pitchfork in the other, meaning, of course, that you can't use either, but that's beside the point. Right, the whole idea was that they're wearing shorts and there's no beards and they're bronzed, and the women are also very muscular, and in those very famous Soviet-looking posters, the women and the men actually look almost identical, which was also, that was very much a part of the point that those posters were trying to make. The whole idea of Zionism was about reinventing the Jew. And a tremendous amount of what strikes us as the ugly, divisive, painful part of Israeli politics, whether it's religious or otherwise, is about the ongoing argument of what should being a Jew mean in the 21st century. This is a slight, it's not 100% accurate because the players are different, but I think it's still worth saying. A mere 22 years pass between 1945 and the liberation of Auschwitz and 1967 and Israeli soldiers breaking through the walls of the old city and reuniting Jerusalem. Everybody in this room is old enough to know that 22 years is an instant. And in 22 years, we go from camps being liberated and people straggling out to an entirely re-envisioned vision of what it means to be a Jew. It wasn't the same people, obviously, so one has to take it with a grain of salt. But Zionism has been at least about two things: about expressing the longings and the yearnings of the Jewish world, about asking as a people, what do we want to express? Where do we come from? What's the story that we tell? What are the books that shape the story that we tell? And in the 21st century now, what should it mean to be a Jew? I think that what Einat said is exactly right. That's what makes Israel an unbelievably interesting and powerful place to be. Whether it's Friday night at the Namal at the port in Tel Aviv, or whether it's a new minyan in Jerusalem called Sion, which is run by a conservative woman rabbi, where literally, when I was there a few weeks ago, you could see men with peyot, not sort of peyot, but USDA choice peyot, and women in shorts and T-shirts, and everybody davening together. And I looked at this group, and first of all, I said, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? That I didn't quite get. But I thought, that's exactly what it's supposed to be. And that's what happens when you read Amos Oz, and when you read David Grossman, and when you read Eshkol Nevo. You have a sense of a society grappling with, what are Jewish yearnings? What are Jewish dreams? What should it mean to be a Jew, and how should we use Jewish power? What are the limits of power? And so on and so forth. Zionism in the 21st century, I think, is about that. It's about asking ourselves very soon after the Shoah, and I'll come back to that in a minute, what do we actually want to be? When I was growing up, high school in the 1970s also, we told a story, or my parents told us a narrative which said, you know, it was a terrible thing what happened in the Shoah. The Jewish people came this close, but look at us now. Israel post-1967, and my parents made Aliyah as part of that huge group of American Jews that made Aliyah in 69. My parents came back with everybody in 1971. Because, no, that's exactly what happened. People went in 69 and they came back in 71 because it turns out it was different than the posters. So, all right, what are you going to do? Nowadays, you don't need the posters because people actually just send you WhatsApp pictures and you say, oh my God, I'm not going there. But in any event, Israel was a complete success story post-1967, and even after 73, there was a sense of tremendous accomplishment, and American Jewish life was thriving. So the narrative that I was raised on was post-Shoah, post-Holocaust. Look at us. We're a people reborn. Sometimes, though, after trauma, you need more time to actually understand the profundity of the trauma itself. If you had been a Jew alive in the year 130 CE, with the temple destroyed, and somebody said to you, what's Judaism going to look like in 800 CE? You would have had to say, I have absolutely no idea. Because Judaism had become entirely sectarian. There were Pharisees who eventually became the rabbis, so we sort of follow them. There were Sadducees who were hoping for a restoration of priestly power. There were Essenes who went out into the desert. There were actually other groups that went out into the desert and formed these like hyper-pure communities of men only. We don't understand why they didn't continue, but apparently they didn't make it. There were a little group called Christians. They've done pretty well since then. But in the year 120, you would have had no idea what Judaism was going to look like. All you knew was that the Judaism that had worked in the past was unalterably destroyed and had gone up in flames with the burning of the Second Temple. Here's what you know at the beginning of the 21st century. There was only one great Jewish community on planet Earth 80 years ago, where millions of Jews lived and had lived for hundreds of years without interruption. That was a Jewish community called Poland. You didn't have that here. You didn't have that in Palestine. You had it nowhere else. And there were 3-point-something million Jews in Poland at the beginning of the war, and there were 300,000 left at the end. If you look at the Shoah through the lens of Poland, Hitler won. He wiped out the most important Jewish community on the planet. Religious and not religious, and educated and uneducated, and yeshiva and literary and newspapers and books. An unbelievably thriving community with lots of problems, to be sure. It's tomorrow after that. And what we know is what you knew in 120 CE. You know that what we had has been destroyed, and we're still trying to figure out what's going to work in a very different world, because America is very different than it was in the 1940s, and certainly Palestine looks very different than it did in the 1940s because there's a sovereign state of Israel. So what do we do with all of that? And I would suggest to you that that brings us back to the questions of Chaim Nachman Bialik, of speaking to that bird who comes from the warm land and say, does dew still fall like pearls on Mount Hermon? What's happening there that's beyond cerebral, that's beyond political, but that touches us deep in our soul, that transforms me when I get off the plane? And when I think about Bialik's poem in the City of Slaughter, what should it actually mean? Okay, we got power. We don't hide behind wooden slatted walls anymore. We take care of the men and the women and the children. And in fact, we take care of people not even in our own country. We bring them from Ethiopia. We rescue them in Entebbe. We just brought them from Yemen. We take care. We changed. But we know that that's not enough, because now we have other questions to deal with. And what I would like to suggest is that for this conversation, which is incredibly important and incredibly painful and incredibly difficult, for this conversation to be a real conversation, we have got to stop focusing the conversation only on those parts of the country that are ultimately dysfunctional or that are problematic and painful. If you get a president in the next 60 days, a little bit less, that you don't really like, You're not going to walk away from America. You're not going to say it's over. You're not. You're not. And you're not coming to our country. I want to tell you something. You're not coming. You don't get to do that. You don't get to do that. And I actually daven 3 times a day with a long list of people that I pray to God will not make Aliyah. Now the truth of the matter is, it's actually not working. But so that's a whole theological issue for me and the Ribbono Shel Olam at a different time. But you know what? In all seriousness, you're not going to flee. Most of you are actually going to roll up your sleeves and say, we've got to fix this place. We have the same problems. The problem is that we are seen by the other great Jewish community in the world too much through the lens of occupation and rabbinate. And that's not what we're about. We face a terribly difficult, painful, grinding, ugly problem in a conflict with the Palestinians. Let's not leave. Let's not get into Bibi. He's here today. One day he won't be. It's been a long time. The occupation started under labor governments, and the settlement started under labor governments. The Likud may or may not be what it once was, but it's not a right-wing issue. It's not a left-wing issue. It's an Israeli problem of not knowing how to fix this because there's not a hell of a lot of good moves on the chessboard. And let's say you think that there are. That's fine. But here's the problem with the social media that I monitor from my perch over there, because I got in before the deadline, that when I monitor American Jewish social media and I listen to the thought leaders about a lot of American Jewish life, all I hear is occupation and rabbinate. And I wonder how many of the young people in college or thereafter can name 5 Israeli novelists and say what Israeli great literary giants are actually talking about and what about the Israeli soul they're really trying to express. I ask myself, when was the last time they watched either Srugim or Shtisel? No, seriously, we have actually 2. I mean, the Srugim is a little few years old. It's about all these unmarried Orthodox kids in Jerusalem, desperate to be married and struggling with their religiosity. The first season is kind of engaging. The second season is a little bit boring. By the third season, you just want somebody to be happy. Please, God, somebody be happy. My wife actually, when we got to the third season, she started to call it No Sex in the City. And now you have a new series called Shtisel. It's about a Haredi family, and it's got top ratings. Think about this. The Haredim aren't watching it. They're not. You can't watch it without a television. So that means that Israelis who are furious about the Haredi, what they see as the parasitic relationship to the Israeli economy, and the parasitic relationship to Tzahal, the IDF, and huge political battles, are still curious. They want to know, what's the magic in that community? What brings them in? What holds them there? What ties them? And this is an unbelievably sympathetic, beautiful look at a Haredi community. Good marriages and bad marriages, and happy children and unhappy children, and successful careers and unsuccessful careers, and believing people and people struggling with faith. And you walk away feeling, okay, the politics are not my politics, but they're another model of what it ought to mean to be a Jew in the 21st century. And I want to engage that before I say I know exactly what I want to be. Here's my plea. There's a lot of things about America that are really not so great. If I get pulled over for a speeding ticket tomorrow, which will be a challenge because I'm flying, but okay. If I get pulled over for a speeding ticket, I'm never worried that I'm going to get shot. My wife might shoot me. But I'm not worried. And there's millions of people in this country who are scared to death that they're going to get shot. It's an abomination. It's a horror. And it's not what America fundamentally is. And there's a lot of people walking around this country who are crazy and have guns. And in my country, I actually tried to get a gun permit. I think I'm a relatively upstanding citizen. I was turned down. Simple argument, you don't need it. That was the argument. You had to prove that you needed it. It's an entirely different way of thinking about guns. But your gun problem in America is a huge problem, but nobody would suggest that you should look at America and say, what's America? America is about black people getting shot at the sides of the road and too many guns. Those are huge problems in America, but America is about something grander, bigger, more noble, more beautiful, more impactful on the entire world. So too is Israel. And all I would suggest by way of conclusion, we can continue the conversation a little bit later, is that if we're going to make this a real and a genuine conversation, do the following test. The next 10 conversations you have about Israel, how many of them do not mention occupation, Iran, BAM, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., and don't mention the rabbinate? Can you have around your Shabbat table, your picnic table, your whatever table, your conversations, wherever you have conversations, can you have deep, abiding, passionate conversations about Israel that don't mention any of those things? Because those are not the things that Israel is. Israel's bialik all over again. The yearning, the soul, the pleading, the love, the desperation, the question of what it should mean to be a new Jew, because we're still right after the Shoah and we don't yet know what it's going to be. We'll have a real conversation, even if we disagree about politics, even if we disagree about the rabbinate. We'll have a conversation when we have a conversation about Israel that takes its enormous problems, puts them into context, and allows the miracle that the Jewish state is to rise to the surface and to shape the way we think about it. Thanks very much.